also do have are some questions that have been posed to us from various guests here, and if it is okay with all of our panel and all of our speakers, I will ask those questions. I'll pose those questions to you directly. First question that we have down here is well, and I'll ask this to David. So the accusation has been leveled at SEJ that you are anti-cycling. How would you respond to that, David?
Anti-cycling. I'm a cyclist, so I can't be anti-cycling on a personal level. I mean, I'm an ambassador for cargo bikes. I never had a car. Every day we do the school run with my 3 young children in the cargo bike. And, you know, if my wife's got a cargo bike, she's taking 2 of them to swimming. I'm on my mountain bike. My son, 9 years old, he's on his mountain bike, and we're off to play tennis. So, you know, certainly not anti-cycling. You know, it's an interesting one. You know, John touched on there around, you know, cycling in terms of the direction it's been taking over the last 10 years has been really focused on a very small group, a very small niche. So when people talk about cycling, often it's saying almost like we've had enough of trying to benefit this particular group. It is, you know, normally affluent, non-disabled men, and everything seems to be built around their need for speed, you know, to get from point A to point B as quickly as possible and timing it. And, you know, they want green light, green light, green light. They don't want to stop. That means going on a pavement and zooming through, you know, past the bus stop, even if there's someone there, you know, and that's not right. You know, we're anti that in terms of, you know, we want a broader, and John mentioned it, you know, to attract more diverse needs for cyclists. Certainly, you know, we've seen over the last years, like campaigning for cycle hangers. One of the things I've been doing, and the response has been to provide lots of cycle hangers in Hackney, you know, thousands of cycle hanger spaces, but they're all for 2-wheel bikes. You know, recently they've said, look, celebration, we're going to have 5,000 cycle hanger spaces by, you know, 2026 or something. And it's like 0 spaces for cargo bikes, 0 spaces for adapted bikes. You know, this is not including families. This is not including people with disabilities. It's still focused on the same group, you know, and while they're doing that, then we're going to have a problem because you're not going to attract the wider group. And even then, these cycle hangers tend to be on very affluent roads. And then you look on the main roads where, you know, and the community roads and where the flats are, where people have got bikes hanging over on, you know, on their balconies, it's not for them. So, you know, the whole targeted thing, once again, the policy, you know, I think what we're against is anti-cycling policies that are not for all, you know, and what we are pro is cycling for everyone. So let's stop taking away bus stops and bus lanes and turn them into cycle lanes, because you're just ruining it for the vast majority of people who actually depend on buses to get to, and they're now stuck in congested traffic. Let's stop taking chunks of pavement between a bus stop and the curb and letting cyclists go through there when you've got elderly, disabled people, people with children trying to get on and off buses. And the priority seems to be just keep these cyclists going. You know, let's find some way of being positive about cycling and being inclusive while we're doing that. If that answers the question, Ollie.
I think that answered it very, very well. Thank you, David. Another question we've had, and I'll ask John this. John, are you really just pro car?
What we're looking for is people to have real choice in the way they travel. Let me give you just a couple of examples. If at the moment you're crossing a major city, in and out of a major city, very often the public transport is there. If you're crossing it orbitally, it's very, very difficult by public transport. But when, for example, Croydon put their tram in, that was an orbital scheme, it enticed many people out of their cars. It also brought economic prosperity to many areas. The Manchester Metro did much the same. Now, we're not saying the whole solution is light rail. It's part of it. But that's the example I give. Let me just give you one other example of it. The a lot of people who are on very low incomes walk huge distances, and they walk huge distances because bus fares are too high. Now, what we're saying is lower the bus fares. There are ways of paying it. It doesn't need to all be subsidy. Lower the bus fares, and then you give people on low incomes real choice. You give them real choice about where they can work. You can give them real choice about where they can find jobs. They don't need to walk everywhere.
David, you spoke a little bit about people with disabilities. There's a question about well, the question is that you didn't care about disability until LTNs came along. Would Stella, perhaps Jane, like to address that question?
Yeah, I can go first if that's okay. Yes, I've heard that many times, again on Twitter, X, whatever it's called now. Yes, so well, from my personal point of view, I have been in nursing for just on 40 years. So I've had a lot of contact, obviously, with people with long-term health conditions and disabilities. And my brother actually has been disabled since age 6 and has driven since he was 16, because disabled people are allowed to learn to drive a year earlier, and has had the most fantastic career, which he would not have had if he wasn't mobile. And he's now 50, and his mobility has definitely decreased over the years. And I have seen that, and I have seen firsthand that if he wasn't driving an adapted car, which is paid for by Motability, by the government, he would be very socially isolated, and he would not be able to work. And of course, disabled people who aren't working obviously perhaps have to claim more benefits. You know, what most people, if you speak to disabled people, they want to be working, they want to be contributing to society, and there are so many barriers to them doing that. And I think transport is one of those barriers at the moment, whether it's public transport, whether it's getting around in cars and navigating around LTNs, whether it's buses, as we said, floating bus stops. So I think, yes, I think, and I've met so many people, Jane, and there's another lady on the call as well, Shiva, that are really struggling every day with various issues around disability. And all the people I've met through SEJ, and even some people I've met through Twitter, are very, very passionate about disability because they have that lived experience, or they've worked in the field. So I don't accept that that sweeping generalisation that we only care about disabilities because we hate LTNs. So no, that is not true.
Thank you, Stella. We did have a hand up from Shiva. I don't know whether Shiva would like to contribute also to that question.
From my perspective, I know that quite often we get told this isn't a war on motorists, it's not a war on cars, you know, all of that kind of stuff. From the perspective of the disabled community that rely on cars or taxis, it's horrendous, and the just all of it is horrendous. And to me, I don't understand how it's happening, because I don't know how any of it meets any of the public sector equality duty stuff, because basically what's happening is disabled people are being made to stay at home. That's what's happening, and I'm one of them. Because every time I go to my city, I risk a fine, or I risk a PCN, because the very symptoms of my disability mean the process that they expect me to go through is almost impossible. So to me, it's direct disability discrimination. Full stop.
If any of the panel would like to respond to that again, then you're more than welcome to. Well, Jane, would you like to? Yeah,
I just wanted to add sort of one more thought about that. just to say that prior to the LTN, I had assumed that councils conducted EQIAs for all their policies, and that when they did them, they consulted with disabled people and their groups, their representative groups. What the LTN did was woke me up to the fact that this is not happening. I find this really shocking, and it needs to change. After the LTN was introduced, the council then introduced school streets on top of the LTN. I really support school streets. However, they had no built-in exemption for SEN transport at all. They still don't. Heard from a mother who lives on the school street, and she told me that SEN transport cannot come to her house to pick up her child. I asked the council if they'd done an EQIA for school streets, and all they responded is that they'd done one for the LTN, which is a completely different scheme. They never answered me about school streets. There's no way to sort of hold them to account. I'm in a borough where it's 54 seats and it's all Labour. We have no opposition, and disabled people and you know, their parents and carers just have no voice. Effectively, we're not being consulted. We're not being informed about decisions that are really impacting. You know, our lives are already more difficult quite often as a result of our children's disability. As I mentioned at the start of my talk, our children often have to go great distances to go to school. They are the most vulnerable group of children, and one of the most vulnerable groups, and yet we're not being included in the decision-making process at all. And this really needs to change. There are much better inclusive ways of doing EQIAs. But, you know, councils are not interested, sadly. So, you know, I'd say to anybody who sort of said, you know, you only, you know, got interested in disability rights through the LTN. But I mean, for a lot of people, I think LTNs were really a wake-up call. It wasn't until that point that they realised, you know, how little power the 2010 Equality Act actually has. What we do about this going forwards, I do not know, but I just feel that this situation needs to change and that our children have been really badly let down.
Thank you, Jane. Sounds like a very, very tricky sort of situation to be in. David, you wanted to contribute also.
Yeah, I mean, like Jane, I'm a massive fan of school streets. I helped to get the first school street in Wandsworth. You know, and we'd come out every morning, we'd put barriers on that side and on that side, and we wouldn't let anybody through, you know, and it was like, go around, find another route, you know. And the second one we went to, there were a number of people who lived inside of where the school street barriers were, and we knew who they were. And when the time comes that they wanted to enter there, we moved, and they drove in and they went home, and you know, and they did so very carefully and very slowly. So, you know, there was that kind of flexibility that kind of demonstrated that, for that flexibility not to be used in order to allow those most vulnerable to get the transportation they need. You know, we're protecting children of the school street, but we're going to discriminate against a child who lives inside a school street who needs to get to school. I mean, that's just crazy. And this is part of this kind of, we must maintain the purity of the scheme. So this is it. The scheme is this way, and we're not letting anybody through. And it's like battle. And this is what's so wrong around the kind of transport policy and the schemes that we've got, where it's almost a group of people saying, this is the way it's going to be done, and it has to be done this way. And there is no grey area. There's no flexibility. There's no give and take. It feels like almost there's no love. It's almost like this is how it has to be done. And if you're not on board, then you're wrong. And this is the way it's going to be done. And, you know, we have to move away from this side of things, you know. You know, John mentioned earlier on about this kind of depository of other people's traffic, and that's not what main roads are for. And yet we get told time and time again, that's where traffic belongs. It belongs on your road, not on my road. As someone who creates the traffic, it belongs on your road. And, you know, in other countries, you know, America, this would be called, you know, environmental racism, that they're taking traffic or whatever and dumping it, you know, in neighborhoods where there are poor and black people. But in the UK at the moment, it seems like that's just okay. You know, whether it's against disabilities or it's against the elderly or it's against, you know, people of color, what's going on right now is just fundamentally wrong. And, you know, that needs to change. And, you know, I'm praying that what we're doing, you know, is going to be, you know, a massive step, and that, you know, hopefully the journalists and the media will pick up and see what this really is as not an alternative to LTNs, because there is no alternative to injustice. You stop doing injustice, but a solution London of a real way forward to make sure we have a just city, and make sure that justice goes right through, in all areas of the UK.
It sounds like you're advocating for less of a sort of team sport sort of approach to LTNs and a more collegiate way of working together to promote policies that work for everybody. So that is brilliant. So thank you for all the responses to that question. I've got another question here about even the wording. So the term boundary roads that are often referred to when talking about LTNs. Why is this an erroneous term?
I mean, I can perhaps say a word or two here, Olive. Clearly, there are roads which are boundary roads. They're the boundaries of LTNs. But it has become really very convenient for a lot of researchers when they're looking at the impact of LTNs to look at only two things: roads within the LTNs and the so-called boundary roads. What they're not looking at very often is the wider transport picture, because they're assuming that it's only boundary roads that might be affected. Now, we know full well from some of the studies that have been done that roads further away are affected because traffic disperses in ways which are not necessarily obvious or very predictable. So there are a number of roads which are not boundary roads. They may be fairly close to the LTNs, but they have seen a substantial increase in traffic. Some of them are main roads, but some of them are not really main roads. Some of them are largely residential roads with schools on them, with nurseries on them, with a lot of people living there, often in social housing. And those roads are, they're not boundary roads, they're not roads within the LTNs, they're not main roads. That's why we call them sacrificial roads, because those people are being sacrificed in order for others, as David was saying, to have a rather nice life of peace and quiet. So we understand the term boundary roads. It is legitimate, but it's not the only road that has been affected.
Thank you, John. And I think we are running out of time, but in the meantime, oh, Stella, sorry, you'd like to come back on that same question?
Yes, it links back to the webinar that Paul Lomax gave a few weeks ago, which is around the traffic counts. Because of course, what we do know is that the traffic counting, the automatic traffic counting strips that councils are using are not managing to capture slow-moving traffic. And slow-moving traffic tends to be on those sort of really sort of busy roads where most of the traffic has been relocated to. But when the councils do their counts, they usually, certainly around Railton LTN where I live, they come up with a 20% decrease in traffic. And there is a real risk that councils aren't actually capturing the amount of traffic on some of the sacrificial roads, whether they're boundary roads or not. And that's something we really have to sort of bottom out, I think, with councils and with national government, because if there's a 20% error, which we know that the companies that are selling these counters to councils are telling them that they know that they can't count slow moving traffic. So and that would make a huge difference to councils who are telling us that there is overall less traffic on the surrounding roads, and that's really important that we try and get particularly councils and national government to take that on board and look at more accurate ways of counting traffic.
Sounds like a very reasonable request, Stella. So thank you very much for contributing there. I think we must make this the last question just because we are running out of time. And I will ask David, your response, climate emergency. How does your policy respond to the climate emergency?
Thank you, Olin. It's a good question. Earlier on I said that climate change, air pollution, in terms of tackling the climate crisis and the national health crisis are two sides of the same coin, and very much so. When we look at climate change and the climate crisis, we're talking about CO2. When we're talking about transport, it's a CO2. But the cars, the vehicles, the trucks, the exhaust actually is CO2, is NO2. The NO2 and the PM2.5, the CO2. So it's the planet, it's public health. So what we do to reduce vehicle miles driven, that's helping the planet, that's actually helping public health. What we do to reduce congestion, again, that's helping the planet, it's improving public health and reducing air pollution. What we're actually in a position of at the moment, very strangely, is people talking about climate safe streets, climate friendly streets, and actually kind of zooming in on a singular street and saying we're going to kind of insulate this street from the climate emergency, which is absolute madness. Even when you think about dispersion of NO2 and PM2.5, but CO2, you can't insulate a street. The idea of a climate friendly neighborhood and so on and so forth, when by default the method they're doing that is actually by design increasing vehicle miles driven in order to make driving less convenient, increasing traffic congestion, because that will be so bad that people will stop driving, traffic evaporation. So they're increasing CO2 emissions, damaging the climate, increasing NO2, damaging public health in order to make people drive less. And, that kind of logic is back to front, let alone the fact that we're supposed to be saying that you cannot have climate action without climate justice. We cannot solve the problems around air pollution unless you're actually tackling the inequalities of it, the social injustice, the social, racial, and environmental injustice. And yet we have a scheme which by design is making it worse, increasing CO2, increasing NO2, making things worse for the people least responsible, most at risk. People who are already walking, already getting the buses, and saying, we're going to make life worse for you to make life better for those most responsible. That's not right. That's nothing to do. Sorry, it's not climate action. And anyone who claims it is kind of defrauding the public. It's a false climate solution. And we need to wake up to this, because it is a climate emergency. We have to take action, but not this kind of action that makes things worse for those least responsible, most at risk. It's absolute nonsense. So in answer to your question, yes, there is a climate emergency. Yes, we have to take action, but let's do it seriously and find solutions that actually will make a difference.
I was going to capture that. We're talking about moving away from the micro to the macro and talking about things holistically as opposed to on that sort of very local level. Fantastic. I think that brings us to the end of the webinar today. So I'd just like to thank all of the panel and all of the guests who have been able to join us today. Like I said at the very beginning, I hope it's provided some food for thought, and I think we will now await for the report to be published so that people can react to it and respond to it in their own way, in their own time. But I'd just like to thank all of you for coming, and on that we will say goodbye, and I hope you'll be able to join us for our next webinar. So thank you very much, everybody.